Welcome everyone to our webinar on FASD in the criminal legal system presented by Dr. Kaitlyn McLachlan. My name is Malou Gabert and I'm a bilingual project assistant at HealthNexus. So HealthNexus oversees several provincial initiatives relating to FASD. We allocate subsidies every year to 40 plus support groups for individuals with FASD and their families. And we design an online training for service providers from various sectors, including healthcare, nursing, education, mental health and addictions, justice and correction, and community and social work. Lastly, we manage the FASD provincial website, fasdinfo.tsav.ca, where you can find recent and up-to-date information about what's happening, learn more about resources and tools, and find out services available in your local community. A few house rules before we start. So we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A section. Remember not to use identifiable information when asking questions. Before we start the presentation, I would like to begin by doing a land acknowledgement. HealthNexus is located on territory that for thousands of years has been the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Wendake Nayon-Wensayo, Haudenosaunee, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're proud to take our part in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. HealthNexus team members are grateful for the opportunity to partner with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and to work on this territory. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Kaitlyn McLachlan, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Guelph and a research lead with the Canada FASD Research Network. Dr. McLachlan's research and clinical interest focus on the intersection of vulnerable individuals in the justice system, and in particular on youth and adults with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. She completed her doctoral degree in clinical psychology with a forensic specialization at Simon Fraser University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alberta and University of British Columbia as a fellow of Kids Brain Health Network. Dr. McLachlan's scholarly and clinical activities focus on the development and translation of evidence to inform effective policy responses in the criminal justice system and more broadly. Thank you for listening. To contact us, you can always reach us at the FASD support at healthnexus.ca email address, and I will now hand it over to Dr. McLachlan.
Terrific, thank you. It takes a minute to get all the controls worked out and the screen things moved around. Malou, just let me know if at some point you can't hear me or you have trouble seeing the slides, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone joining us here today. I'm really looking forward to sharing this time with you and a topic that I'm really passionate about, including a range of relevant aspects of FASD in the criminal legal system. So by way of introductions, I don't need to say much more. I like to share just a little bit about my background. So as that very lovely introduction covered, my name is Kaitlyn McLachlan. I'm a clinical psychologist with background and training in clinical and forensic psychology, and also a member in good standing of the College of Psychologists in Ontario. And my interests lay really at the intersection of mental health, neurodevelopmental disability, and all aspects of psychology, and in particular, the criminal legal system. And that's where the forensic psychology piece comes together to try and understand different aspects of people's experiences and evidence-based policy solutions relevant to a whole range of areas and stages of the criminal legal system. So I'm an associate professor in the clinical child and adolescent psychology program at the University of Guelph, and have previously worked clinically in forensic contexts, inpatient and outpatient, with adolescents and adults. And as was mentioned, I'm also really proud to be the Justice Research Lead with the Canada FASD Research Network. And all of those sort of experiences and background come together. And I'm going to lead you through a bit of a whirlwind presentation today, but wanted to really help first introduce FASD to give just a tiny bit of a primer in case we have any folks who are newer to the field joining us today, and then really focus on where I see some of the relevance of FASD legally from a criminal legal perspective around folks' experience and needs. And I'll end with some policy change into action sorts of solutions and recommendations. And through the presentation, I'm a researcher, so there'll definitely be some research and data that I share. Feel free to take notes and ask questions if you have any at the end. And if I speak about a paper or a project or a study that you're interested in learning more about, you'll see that I share my email address and really welcome questions or follow-up questions by email after the presentation. So to get started, FASD in Canada is a diagnostic term used to describe the broad range of neurodevelopmental impacts on the brain and body of individuals prenatally exposed to alcohol. Prenatal alcohol exposure can result in lifelong impacts, and there's a whole lot of diversity and variability in terms of the way folks can experience impacts across brains and bodies, shifting from person to person. Most folks with FASD will experience some degree of challenges in their daily living and need supports to really flourish and reach their full potential. And like everyone, individuals with FASD are unique, and like everyone, have areas of both strengths that we can capitalize on and support in helping to navigate challenges that they may experience in their day-to-day living. Our key message that I try and share whenever I speak about FASD is just to remind everyone that alcohol is a really potent or powerful teratogen. That's a factor that can impact typical development in pregnancy, and that FASD occurs in the context of social determinants of health. And that means that a pregnancy can be impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure, or folks can actually have FASD in all populations and communities and settings where alcohol is used. And that this is important to remember when we're thinking about who could be at risk for having FASD and who may be in need of supports and preventative services. Just to touch a little bit on the emerging but still limited data around how many people we think may have FASD, the research is still pretty limited in Canada. Our best estimates, based on a small number of studies in North America more generally, place a ballpark estimate of FASD at around 4% or 4 in 100, translating into just over 1.5 million folks in Canada. And the costs associated with supporting folks with FASD to really thrive and flourish can be expensive. But you'll see that from some costing studies that the higher drivers of costs are associated with factors that you might not automatically think would be associated with those costs. So we're going to talk about the criminal legal system today, and some studies in Canada have suggested that costs associated with being involved in the criminal legal system are amongst the highest current drivers associated with FASD in respect to providing supports and when people come into contact with the criminal legal system. I'm going to share a key message that I often share at the beginning of talking about FASD in the criminal legal system. And that's to say there's no single pathway or outcome or journey that any person navigates, whether they have FASD or not. There's, while I'm going to talk about some higher rates of FASD in criminal legal system and common concerns that we hear from folks themselves and also their families about risk of becoming involved in the criminal legal system, the pathways and experiences of needs of folks with FASD are totally unique to each individual, and there's no set course across the lifespan that means that folks' paths or trajectories or experiences or risk of coming into contact with the criminal legal system will be the same. A good colleague of mine, Dr. Kaitlyn McLachlan at the Canada FASD Research Network, wrote in an article where she and other colleagues synthesized the literature on FASD in the criminal legal system a few years ago, that FASD does not result in criminality, but rather folks with FASD may experience an increased cluster of risk factors that can lead to different kinds of difficulties, including engagement in the criminal legal system. And so while these are concerns that folks may have and experiences that they may be navigating, there are lots of opportunities for support, for prevention, for intervention, and for not having that contact with the criminal legal system as well. So what does the rate of sort of contact of folks with FASD in Canada look like in respect to the criminal legal system? The first study I'm going to share some findings with you today was published a couple of years ago. Time is really changing and warping amidst the pandemic time that we've just come through. But together, colleagues and I looked at the kinds of difficulties that adolescents, transitioned aged youth, and adults with FASD experience in their daily living. And we sought to really understand what kinds of difficulties people were experiencing across a range of areas, including school disruption, housing problems, and in particular, relevant to this talk, legal problems related to offending, breaking the law, and also becoming incarcerated in different kinds of correctional facilities. And so these data were drawn from the National FASD database. That's a project led by the principal investigator, Dr. Jocelyn Cook, and supported by the Canada FASD Research Network, that is a real-time repository of clinical data from diagnostic clinics across Canada that help us really take a Canada-centered and really good look at what the needs are of folks with FASD so that we can better respond to them in practice. And so what did we see? This slide reports on data from 508 people assessed after 2016 from clinics all over Canada, and includes adolescents, transition to aged youth, and adults who were diagnosed with FASD. And you can see that, not too surprisingly, folks experienced high rates of difficulties across multiple domains, including problems with employment and problems with independent living, and in particular, pretty high rates of difficulties related to offending and also becoming incarcerated. And so these kinds of findings cue us to the fact that there are likely missed and really critical identification and intervention support opportunities that we can offer so that by the time folks are hitting diagnostic clinics, they're not experiencing these high rates of difficulties. The takeaways from this study in respect to the criminal legal system, as I just mentioned, point to these key gaps. There are some limitations to this data set. It doesn't give us really detailed or nuanced information about the kinds of difficulties and the real depth and nature of difficulties people are experiencing. We just know, yes, no, are they experiencing those levels of difficulties? So it's pretty coarse in terms of our understanding. And that leaves a lot of important questions and opportunities to better understand what kinds of trajectories or journeys or pathways folks are experiencing when they first come into contact with police, for instance, what kinds of supports might be effective and protective against continued or really problematic involvement in the criminal legal system. And that data can all help us really develop effective policy and intervention resources for improved outcomes. So if we zoom in a little bit more, those last data were from clinical settings across Canada. And so folks in that earlier study were all accessing diagnostic assessment services across Canada. The data I'm going to show you here come from studies that have looked at rates of FASD across different kinds of forensic and correctional programs and populations. So it's really zoomed in, saying in this particular institution or in this particular place, if we do a whole bunch of assessments to see who could have FASD, how many people meet diagnostic criteria. And I've just placed on the left of this slide that 4% estimate that we have for the general population. And then you can see from this small number of studies that have some limitations in terms of focusing on small populations, small numbers of people, and sort of unique specific settings. But you see much, much higher elevated rates of folks meeting criteria for FASD in those settings, including most recently research published by my good colleague from CanFASD, Dr. Mansfeld Mella, who found that 46% of folks in their at discharge from a federal correctional psychiatric facility met diagnostic criteria. Together, these rates from clinical diagnostic populations and correctional or forensic or legal settings suggest that as many as 30 to 60% of people have been in trouble with the law, and that youth with FASD are at great elevated risk of being incarcerated compared to youth without FASD, and that rates of FASD are much, much higher in correctional settings compared to the general population. And so that sort of alerts us to something that requires more attention, that tells us that more attention around policy and intervention and different kinds of program and responses is really needed to help address that overrepresentation. And importantly, across the studies that I've described so far, particularly that last set in forensic and correctional contexts, one key finding was that most people who participated in those research studies trying to understand how many people could have FASD in different facilities, across those studies, the majority of people had not been previously identified or diagnosed with FASD. And that also tips us off to a problem that our research team has been spending a lot of time sort of really thinking about in terms of missed identification, sort of missing the fact that somebody could have FASD. And I'll talk a little bit later about what that missed identification misses in terms of opportunities for understanding and providing really tailored supports and services. So now I'm going to talk more broadly about FASD across legal and forensic contexts. And FASD has relevance across a whole range of time points, processes, and places in respect to thinking about the criminal legal system. We know from some emerging research that youth and adults with FASD have higher rates of the risk factors that we think might increase their chances of getting into trouble with the law or continuing to commit crimes after they've been arrested, and also higher rates of needs that need the right kinds of supports in order for folks to experience success desisting from contact with the criminal legal system. Some of my own research and research from our team in my research group at the University of Guelph has found that folks with FASD may have difficulty understanding their legal rights when they're arrested, understanding and really effectively participating meaningfully in the complexity of a criminal legal trial. They may be at increased vulnerability for making false confessions. And currently a graduate student in my lab, Kaitlyn McLachlan, is doing a whole program of research trying to understand factors that may impact adolescents with FASD and young adults' ability to make really reasoned decisions about their legal rights that reflect understanding and appreciation of the kinds of really important and critical legal decisions that they're being asked to make once they're making their way through the different stages and components of a criminal trial. So I've mentioned this one, that their ability to fully and meaningfully participate without the right kinds of supports may be limited, that FASD is under-recognized and may not be recognized and appropriately supported, and that then programs delivered as usual without appropriate accommodations or shifts may not be effective, and folks may not understand why people are not succeeding or having difficulties navigating programs without additional accommodations or shifts. There's also really, and I'm going to make this point a couple of times today, limited research on the kinds of interventions and programs in criminal legal contexts that have a good evidence base to show us that they're really effective and helpful. And broadly, I'm sure many of you have had this experience, and something we continue to see, that community-based programs and supports, both in everyday settings outside of the criminal legal system, as well as more specifically for folks who become involved in the criminal legal system in Canada and elsewhere in the world, continue to be very limited. And that can again introduce difficulties for folks trying to effectively navigate this experience and reach successes and desired outcomes beyond the criminal legal context. So all kinds of studies have shown relevance across different stages of the criminal legal system, from arrest, through trial, through sentencing, through community management, through supporting folks and effectively supporting their time in correctional programs, and then at transition back to community at discharge from correctional programs. Another increasing area of research suggests that legal evidence at trial or in legal adjudication about FASD and PAE is very common. Our own research team, again led by Kaitlyn McLachlan, a graduate student at the University of Guelph, reviewed all of the Canadian criminal legal published available decisions that included evidence about FASD or prenatal alcohol exposure over a 10-year period ending up just a couple of years ago. And what we found was that evidence about FASD was considered in a wide range of cases, most commonly reported in decisions at sentencing, but that very few cases reported really up-to-date, accurate diagnostic information or an assessment having been conducted recently to confirm that a person had FASD, and only half of the cases suggested that a person had had a previous formal actual diagnosis of FASD. So lots of information was making it into cases without a lot of really up-to-date, current, detailed information about the kinds of areas of strength and the kinds of unique areas of need that a person with FASD may actually have. And that can be complicating for legal decision makers to really then understand how evidence about FASD should be applied or meaningfully considered in reaching a legal decision or a sentence about folks with FASD. Other common themes that we saw included challenges really balancing mitigation or the idea of having reduced culpability due to FASD as a mitigating factor, with the need to maintain public protection and an important recognition of a lack of treatment and support options that really had decision makers challenged on how to make the most effective and appropriate use of that information. We also saw legal decision makers really needing to rethink legally what rehabilitation looks like for people with FASD, shifting and recognizing that rehabilitation and that improved outcomes can look like different outcomes with the right kinds of supports in place, as opposed to a complete change or elimination of the kinds of difficulties a person with FASD may experience. A few other findings that were highlighted included not really having enough expert testimony to help legal decision makers understand the information they were grappling with, and not a lot of great information linking the clinical information about FASD to the legal decision that actually needed to be made at hand. So for those of you who are really interested in this topic and would like to learn more about it, feel free to get in touch. This data was just accepted for publication. It will be out in a paper sometime in the next couple of months. And a huge shout out to all the graduate and undergraduate students in our research group and collaborators and colleagues who collaborated on that project. And so lastly, I thought here in terms of talking about relevance, I would share a little bit about what factors may come together to potentially help us understand how people with FASD may come to have elevated risk for involvement in the criminal legal system. And so here, research is really best still characterized as emerging, and the gaps remain in terms of, as I've mentioned already, understanding what somebody's pathway or experiences in the criminal legal system look like, and really from a good data or evidence-based perspective, what the risk and protective factors are associated with those elevated rates of criminal legal contact. But lots of factors we think come together, and I've sort of shown a few here that I think are relevant to think about. So first, folks with FASD experience a wide range of differences or difficulties related to neurodevelopmental functioning. Neurodevelopmental impairment associated with FASD, well, let me try to go back there instead of forward, hang on. There we go. Span a whole range of domains. I've included those that are assessed in the Canadian diagnostic approach for understanding whether somebody can have FASD. And you can see how some of these areas could have relevance in terms of somebody's function, somebody's ability to function meaningfully across different legally relevant stages. Folks may experience difficulties in their academic skills and challenges at school, trouble remembering things, trouble paying attention. Difficulties with executive functioning are particularly sort of hallmark or seen commonly amongst folks with FASD, and that can make it tough, particularly like in high pressure situations, to really take that cool brain thinking planfully and be able to make the kinds of decisions that you may need more time and space to make. We also see lots of support needs related to adaptive behavior or sort of the daily activities that are required for independence. In that same study that I mentioned earlier, where we looked at the kinds of difficulties that folks with FASD experienced, in particular adolescents, transitioned aged youth, and adults, we looked at how many areas of neurodevelopmental impact were experienced on average by folks who were diagnosed with FASD with sentinel facial features, without sentinel facial features, those flagged at risk for potentially having FASD but not meeting diagnostic criteria when they were assessed, and those where FASD was ruled out. And we found very high rates of impairment. So even though we see lots of differences in diversity in terms of the particular areas that a person may benefit from more support in, you can see that folks diagnosed with FASD had, on average, across the sample of 726 folks, between 5 and 6 areas impaired out of 10. And so I just shared this slide to sort of show and speak to you that the overall rate of difficulties in these areas is common amongst folks with FASD, and later you'll hear me speak a little bit about why it's so important to then ensure that we understand each unique individual's areas of sort of strength and difficulties, so that we provide the right kinds of tailored services and supports to help them really do their best, knowing where they may need a little bit more help and where they may really shine. These neurodevelopmental impairments or areas of impact can translate into meaningful difficulties in everyday situations, including in the criminal legal context. So it can be more difficult to communicate effectively, to make decisions, particularly in stressful situations. Folks may have differences in terms of the way they interact with peers or their level of psychosocial maturity. They may have difficulty with suggestibility, particularly in situations with folks in positions of authority. They may have trouble sort of thinking flexibly, again, particularly under stress and predicting consequences. And this can all translate into difficulties making decisions or having sort of difficulties with impulsivity around potentially committing crimes, as well as navigating the legal process once police are involved and a charge has been pressed. Layering on those levels of neurodevelopmental impairment, we know that rates of environmental adversity or difficulties experienced across the lifespan also tend to be higher amongst folks with FASD as a population. And these kinds of adversities documented have included other kinds of prenatal exposures, other kinds of impacts to pregnancy that can impact development, higher rates of caregiving placement disruptions or involvement in the child welfare system, high rates of ACEs or abuse and trauma and neglect, different kinds of stressful household exposures, and then later difficulties with school and employment, housing, and dependent living. And those factors can also add risk and need specialized attention to be supported so that that risk is minimized when we think about the kinds of factors that could come together and have somebody end up having contact with the criminal legal system. FASD is also often described as a complex neurodevelopmental disability, or one where there are multiple concurrent additional areas of needed support that folks experience. Estimates of having additional mental health related needs and difficulties range as high as 90%. And we know that there are additional physical health comorbidities and needs impacts to the body as well that are common for individuals with FASD. So in addition to those areas of neurodevelopmental impairments, folks may be also in need of supports and would really benefit for supports around their mental health and also their physical health. This all kind of operates in a larger socio-contextual context where we don't have enough supports, identification, interventions, resources, where folks working in settings both in the criminal legal system and outside the criminal legal system don't have enough knowledge, understanding, and awareness about FASD, and where stigma related to FASD, and in particular, folks in the criminal legal system, really prevails and can come together to lead to a real increased place of vulnerability. And layering on this in the background are other kinds of environmental and genetic risk factors that each need consideration when we're really trying to understand an individual person's pathway into and through the criminal legal system. Increasingly, the FASD research and clinical fields, led in huge part by folks with FASD themselves, have really encouraged and focused on the importance of balancing the narrative, and that continuing to focus only on areas of risk or difficulty can really perpetuate some of that stigma and negative perceptions of kind of fixed outcomes and problematic experiences for folks with FASD. And I'm glad to say that together with colleagues, I think that narrative is really starting to shift, and it's foundationally important to recognize the strengths and abilities that people with FASD have, including in criminal legal contexts, that can be leveraged to help promote success and thriving. So in a recent scoping review completed by Dr. Katie Flanagan and some folks with CanFASD and members of our research team at the University of Guelph, they reviewed the entire literature and found that core areas of strengths and abilities were really prominent and important for folks with FASD, including a strong sense of self-awareness, receptiveness to support, a capacity for human connection, and perseverance through challenges, as well as hope for the future. And in addition, this research is hot off the presses. It's so hot, it's not actually quite yet on the presses. But Chantal Ritter is a graduate student in our team at the University of Guelph, and her dissertation really focuses on trying to understand key strengths and protective factors, specifically amongst youth who have been involved in the criminal legal system. So the table that I'm showing you here are not quite yet published, but soon to be out there, data from a literature review that she conducted, trying to understand what the research field tells us at this point might be really key strength and protective factors to consider in more holistically supporting the needs of youth who've become involved in the criminal legal system. And these don't differ too dramatically from those found in the earlier review, but have, I think, unique tailored relevance as they've all been demonstrated amongst folks with criminal legal system involvement. So Chantal has looked at these factors using a ecological framework, looking at the level of the individual, and found factors like resilience and hope and personal strengths to be really important. At that familial relational level in the context of where folks are living and who's supporting them, that having access to appropriate structure and supervision, supports, stability and routine, and healthy pro-social supportive relationships are really key. And then at that broader contextual and community level, access to supportive education and employment opportunities, access to supports more broadly, as well as that really critical protective factor of having early diagnosis, recognition, and then hopefully earlier provision of appropriate supports can have a really preventative impact from a protective perspective. Chantal's also in the middle of conducting additional, I think, really important and critical research. She's interviewing caregivers of folks, of youth who have experienced criminal legal contact to find out more about their lived expertise perspectives on what strengths and protective factors are most critical in their understanding of their young person's involvement in the criminal legal system, as well as what healthy outcomes look like beyond just focusing on desistance or lack of recidivism or you know, often in the criminal legal context, we think about the outcome that folks really want to look at is no longer being involved in the criminal legal system. And that's a really critical goal because it's not healthy or a really being involved in the criminal legal system can have really significant adverse impacts to health and well-being, but that there are also additional ways of understanding healthy and desired outcomes. And so she's really working hard to learn about that from the perspective of caregivers and later down the road, also youth themselves. So stay tuned for, I think, this exciting research that will be coming out soon. Zooming out a little bit further, there are a lot of system level challenges that complicate the experience of really being able to respond most effectively to folks with FASD involved in the criminal legal system. I've talked about under recognition. I've talked about lack of insufficient awareness, knowledge, and skills. And in my time working in the field, I've really seen incredible growth around professionals' willingness and interest and engagement in becoming FASD informed. It's really been an exciting time to hear and learn and speak with so many professionals who want to really become skilled and are really champions around sharing knowledge and evidence-based approaches to supporting folks with FASD in legal contexts. We continue to experience real strains and limitations around diagnostic capacity for being able to do FASD-informed assessment and diagnosis. And this is true broadly across Canada, and also very true specifically for folks involved in the criminal legal system, and in particular, adults. There are not very many funded pathways or opportunities for adults to access an assessment and possible diagnosis of FASD, and those avenues are even shrunk further amongst adults involved in the criminal legal system. There, as a result, are associated continued gaps in funding and resources. It can be really challenging because of the way the criminal legal system works and because of people's health privacy and information privacy once they become involved in the criminal legal system, for the right kinds of information and communication to be shared between treatment providers, members of the care team, and criminal legal professionals themselves. And this can create gaps in understanding and missed opportunities for supports. If we take all of this together, I think there are lots of ways that we can move into action and improving outcomes. And this is an area of research that our team has really been involved in with lots of collaborators over the last few years, and remains an exciting part of the work that we're doing. So I think I've made the case already. I think you're all here today for the same reasons. And I hear across studies and research the real interest and need for folks, clinicians and professionals, caregivers, to become more FASD informed. And this is true amongst forensic clinicians too. So psychiatrists and psychologists who might be the ones actually doing psychological or forensic assessments amongst folks who become involved in the forensic or criminal legal systems. We surveyed professionals internationally to find out whether they felt like their own knowledge and training experiences had prepared them for practice. And what we found was that while the majority of forensic professionals, clinicians in particular, lots of them were psychologists, had practical experience or they were aware that they'd worked with someone with FASD, largely they really felt inadequately trained and ill prepared for practice effectively. And you can see across the data that I'm showing here that they felt inadequately prepared to identify or recognize that somebody could have FASD or another neurodevelopmental disorder. Many felt inadequately prepared to diagnose FASD or even conduct forensic assessments or provide treatment. And so we see this kind of pattern again across professional practice surveys of lawyers, judges, clinicians, legal professionals. But as I mentioned earlier, in our study and in others, folks have really explained and have been enthusiastic about identifying additional training opportunities. And so I think that this is an exciting area where really being able to design and deliver evidence-based training to these audiences stands to make large impact. One of the most common questions and areas that I get asked about is around evidence-based identification and screening. So lots of questions and interest in picking up a screening tool and implementing screening, including in criminal legal contexts. And this is an area that our research team has actually been doing a lot of work in over the last few years. It can be challenging to recognize that somebody may have FASD for lots of the reasons that I've mentioned already. We know now that a large majority of folks, particularly by adulthood, don't have sort of a physical presentation that would make it easy or obvious to recognize that they could have FASD. We know, and I've mentioned, that no two folks with FASD are alike, just like no two folks are alike, and that they experience really variability in the kinds of areas of needs that they have. And that can be differences between people, but also differences within a person from day to day or from situation to situation. And this sort of complexity and variability can lead to it being a bit more difficult for professionals to recognize that FASD could help explain what's going on. So we see high rates of missed diagnosis where folks aren't recognized, and also misdiagnosis, where they may have lots of other labels applied to try and understand what's going on, but miss the fact that it could be FASD that's accounting for some of those difficulties. It can be difficult to confirm prenatal alcohol exposure, in part due to heavy and ongoing continued stigma around alcohol use in pregnancy, as well as around FASD more generally. It can also be difficult to access information about prenatal alcohol exposure for folks who are in care or for folks who are older in the criminal legal system, where records or information from family members or other agencies may no longer be available, just given that the time given the time that would have passed. And so as prenatal evidence about prenatal alcohol exposure is still required in most cases to diagnose FASD, this can create another diagnostic and identification challenge. As I've mentioned, we have limited diagnostic capacity, and that limited professional knowledge and training can also impact recognition that FASD could be at play. But there are a whole range of benefits of recognition or implementing, formal identification or screening programs. For the individual, it can help us to understand their own strengths and needs so that we can develop accommodation and plans and adjustments to tailor the way that we work every day in supporting folks. Recognizing that somebody could have FASD can help us make decisions about who should be referred for a diagnostic assessment for FASD in particular, but also can help us think about if wait lists are long or diagnostic resources are not available, what other kinds of assessments may be helpful, psychological or neuropsychological assessments, assessments of physical health, assessments with speech language, for instance. And it can also inform the kinds of supports and interventions that can be put into place right away rather than waiting for diagnosis or that more comprehensive and much needed FASD interdisciplinary evaluation. Recognizing that somebody could have FASD can help begin the conversation around supports and connections for individuals with FASD themselves, for their caregivers, and also for their broader networks of support so that folks are plugged into the right kinds of appropriate teams, communities, and networks of care. And more broadly, at an institutional level or at a higher program level, understanding how many people could have FASD in your program or area of service delivery can help make really important decisions around resource allocation and informing program and policy decisions. So lots of really important benefits associated with screening and identification. And in our work, we've been thinking a lot about not just screening, so picking up a screening tool and sort of more formally completing a checklist that will let you know if somebody is or isn't at risk of having FASD. We've been thinking a lot about conceptualizing broader strategies for identifying and recognizing that somebody could have FASD. And at the one end, this includes building an FASD-informed team so that folks are really ready and able to recognize when someone could be experiencing difficulties and have support needs related to FASD, and so that members of each team know how to have person-centered, respectful, and ethical conversations about FASD with clients and individuals that they're working with. They can incorporate brief screening questions at intake. They can invite conversations with clients and their families and caregivers about FASD at different stages of their program involvement. And at the further, more structured end, they can also implement a formal FASD screening tool or process. And I just want to point out here that using a screening tool can't actually entirely identify that somebody has FASD. It can identify somebody who may be at risk of having FASD and would benefit from a more fulsome assessment. You really need a gold standard clinical diagnostic evaluation to know for sure whether somebody could have FASD. In our research team, we've been thinking a lot about what are the best approaches to screening using more formal tools in criminal legal contexts, whether they be forensic or correctional contexts or courts. And so we're in the middle of conducting a very large review of all the screening tools and items on screening tools that have been developed and implemented in legal contexts. The great news is that there are a whole lot of instruments that have been developed, more than 11, and have just at least a little bit of data of relevance to the criminal legal context. But thus far, our early findings suggest that the amount of evidence really supporting that these tools are valid and help us identify the right folks remains very limited. There's much greater need for research to ensure that these tools can accurately identify people who are at risk of having FASD and accurately also recognize people who are not at risk of having FASD. And there's really still limited information about how to implement these tools or really set them up and start using them in a way that we know is likely to ensure that the goals associated with screening for FASD are reached and that harm doesn't come from the screening process and that folks who screen positive are effectively supported and that those resources are in place. So for those who'd like to learn a little bit more about that, I'll share some resources in a minute where we've talked about some of those implementation considerations that we really encourage teams to work through collectively and collaboratively if they're thinking about implementing FASD screening. This is also just a little plug for an exciting ongoing project that's being conducted collaboratively between the Asante Center, colleagues at the University of Alberta and University of Saskatchewan, and the Canada FASD Research Network funded by the BC Law Foundation, where we are working to increase the capacity to identify and support individuals with FASD and complex neurodevelopmental needs by updating a screening tool and screening toolkit that will, we hope, be really helpful to folks in a range of different kinds of roles who may be working to support individuals with FASD across the criminal legal settings. So stay tuned from our group with a little bit more about that over the next few years as well. I won't say a ton about modifying treatment and adjusting practice and accommodations. I think there's lots to be said. We could do an entire webinar on how to respond and really navigate and flex and adapt creatively to work well with folks with FASD and recognize each of their unique needs. There are lots of pro tips for modifying treatment that often include planning for more time, sharing rules and information, often to help really support memory and learning, really maintaining a creative and flexible problem-solving mindset to understand not just the problem that you're seeing, but what could actually be going on to help explain where gaps are occurring or where there may be disconnects so that you can support a different way of doing things, allowing more time, including groups of care, whether that's family, other caregivers, or support systems so that individuals are not navigating meetings and complex situations independently in the case that they may benefit from having supports, and lots of different ways of providing those accommodations. For those of you interested in really learning more about this, I encourage you to look at a couple of different guides and resources that are freely available online that have been put together by colleagues with the Canada FASD Research Network. So the first that I'm showing you here is called Moving Towards FASD-Informed Care in Substance Use Treatment. It's not specific or tailored to the criminal legal context, but you'll see a whole range of approaches to using a person-centered framework and strength-based approach to accommodating practice and treatment for individuals with FASD, tailored to the substance use treatment context. And in that guide, we've included a whole section on identification and screening, including implementation strategies and some screening instruments that we think may be helpful or promising in terms of being able to be implemented in those contexts. Another guide that I really appreciate was developed by my good colleague, Dr. Jackie Pye, the research lead for Canada, the Canada FASD Research Network, and it takes a strengths and person-centered approach towards promoting healthy outcomes for individuals with FASD that I think translates across contexts, including the criminal legal context. So I've included the link there where you can access those resources. I'm going to say a little bit less about this. I said quite a bit about it already, but I think in order to really fully understand each person with FASD, there's real incredible value in having a comprehensive evaluation, looking at different aspects of each individual. So using an interdisciplinary team and really making sure that we understand each person's unique profile of support area needs and areas of strength. And that can be achieved through comprehensive evaluation, whether it be, and importantly, through interdisciplinary FASD diagnostic evaluation, and then also by ensuring that different kinds of professionals are being able to help just fill those puzzle pieces in for individuals with FASD themselves and for their circles of care, and the other kinds of professionals who may be working to understand and support their needs. That's really what helps us shift towards understanding those needs and then responding most effectively. And that's true for the criminal legal context as well as other settings more broadly. There's probably not going to be an expert everywhere. And so I think there can be huge benefit to consulting as well. In the criminal legal context, often folks have expertise in different areas and not everyone will share the same areas of expertise. And so if you're an individual experiencing contact with the criminal legal system or a care provider or a caregiver trying to support someone navigating that system, and the folks that you're working with don't have that kind of expertise, you can advocate for or connect with folks who do have that kind of FASD-informed expertise so that the legal professionals, clinical professionals, and FASD-informed professionals can share all that information and bring it together to ensure that really holistic understanding. And last, I think, again, we could get an entire webinar to really developing evidence-based programs and supports and options to meet the needs of individuals who with FASD become involved in the criminal legal system. This is an area where we continue to need really important advocacy and growth. The great news in Canada is that there are really amazing projects running right now that are unique in the world. And I think as we get evaluation information and further evidence showing the kinds of positive impacts that they can have, we're going to really be pushing that agenda forward in terms of thinking creatively about responding differently to better support outcomes for individuals with FASD. So we see specialized problem-solving courts that are tailored specifically to meet the needs of individuals with FASD in Manitoba, as well as criminal legal system focused clinical diagnostic teams who are working to complete assessments and FASD diagnosis for folks as they navigate the trial or legal adjudicative process. We're seeing specialized programs in terms of being able to identify using a really reconciliation-oriented lens of understanding an individual's background and factors in terms of GLADU writing programs across Canada. There are lots of really neat integrated and interdisciplinary collaborative legal programs that bring together police and community agencies. And so I think it's an exciting time to really be seeing the different ways that we're responding, and also a really important time to make sure we get that evidence to ensure that decisions around investing in resources and extending pilot programs and really building the policy case for FASD-informed intervention programs in the criminal legal context can be made. So I'll leave you with a couple of takeaway messages, thinking from the past through the present and the future. I would argue that recognition of FASD remains a major public health issue in the criminal legal system, and that many aspects of the criminal legal system do not effectively address the needs of individuals with FASD, and in many cases can result in pretty significant harm for individuals with FASD themselves, their broader communities as well. There are important knowledge gaps in terms of having the skills and awareness around FASD to really be able to effectively support those needs in criminal legal contexts, whether it be in clinicians, legal professionals, judges, lawyers, and we continue to need to really train and support that knowledge and skill so that folks can respond effectively. There are promising programs and interventions and alternative approaches to supporting individuals in the criminal legal context, but we really need the evidence to help make a policy case and research more broadly to ensure that the kinds of decisions we're making around criminal law, resource allocation, and system change are evidence informed and likely to result in the outcomes that we want them to result in. And this research is most effectively completed if it's partner engaged, includes the perspectives and lived expertise of people with FASD and their families and care circles at the center of the research process, if they maintain that balanced narrative and a strength-based focus and are really collaborative in nature. I'll continue to work away at making the case for how important improved screening and preventative supports can be. So our work around screening focuses on criminal legal contexts, but earlier screening and recognition programs at well child checkups and early in the school years can stand to make really critical early recognition and understanding and allow that pathway for early supports and preventative efforts to be put into place. And really making sure that our programming is evidence-based and that we continue to collect evidence to ensure that the promising programs that we think might really be helpful get uptake and continued funding and implementation. I would like to acknowledge, as I have through my talk, the incredible team at the research group that I get to work with, the undergraduate and graduate students together in our team at the University of Guelph, and the Psychology, Law, and Neurodevelopmental Research and Policy group are just doing outstanding work. You can check out our website to learn more about different projects and research opportunities. We're always interested in meeting with professionals, hearing from individuals with FASD themselves, and so you can learn about our current studies by going to our website. All of the research I've shared today has been the collaborative work of many, many, many collaborators and contributors, too many to list here. And really importantly, I'd like to especially acknowledge folks with FASD themselves, participants, their families, their caregivers, and different professional agencies, communities, and clinics who have dedicated their time and given their time to helping us really learn how to sort of forward this agenda of making sure that we understand and can better support and address the needs of folks with FASD, including those who become involved in the criminal legal system. I'll also acknowledge CanFASD and again, Health Nexus for the invitation to present today. So thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions here at the end. I genuinely do mean that you can feel free to contact me by email. You can see lots of the resources I shared today on the Canada FASD Resource Network, and you can also follow us on Twitter. So without further ado, I will sign off from sharing and turn it back over to you, Lou.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Doctor. It was very informative. It was really good. We have a few questions. So we received a question. Someone was asking, why would they be making false confessions? Is this a result of the person not knowing their rights and understanding the words asking their relationship to the crime? For example, a question might be, where were you at the crime scene? Walking by the crime, not knowing the consequence of the answer. A person with FASD might say, yes, I was at the crime scene. The person has admitted to being at the crime scene and is prosecuted as such. Is that what you meant by false confession?
That is a great question. And there is a whole huge area of research looking at false confessions more broadly, not just risk of false confessions among particular groups of people or risk factors for false confessions. And the question actually really aptly highlights the fact that there can be lots of ways and reasons for which people may make false confessions. Some people may wrongly admit or falsely admit to doing something to as the result of pressure in an interview or promises in an interview. Some people may confess to protect another person. The youth that we interviewed indicated that they wrongly confessed to crimes or pled guilty when they hadn't actually conducted the crime, talked about trying to protect another person, trying to end the interview. But there are also factors where the kinds of admissions and statements that people make are likely not in their best interest when they're being investigated by police. They may not fully understand. Our research shows that they may have difficulty understanding their right to remain silent and the right to be represented by counsel. And that even if they understand that those rights are available to them, really appreciating what those rights can do to protect them in that situation where there's that imbalance of power between the individual and the police or the state, being able to say, I know what a lawyer is or what a lawyer is knowledgeable about versus how a lawyer might be really important in terms of helping my interests in this moment reflects that sort of deeper level of understanding. So folks can certainly be providing information that may not be in their best interests in the context of interacting with police, when perhaps providing that information or having had advice from a lawyer may be really important, particularly for serious offenses. There's also areas of research and really famous cases of people fully coming to believe that they committed a crime when they actually didn't commit the crime and wrongly taking responsibility for it, and all kinds of reasons in between. But certainly we did have youth in that one study acknowledge having wrongfully taken responsibility for a crime. And an important area of research in our lab right now is actually around plea decision making. So making a decision as to whether or not to plead guilty for a crime, especially in the context of when incentives or deals are being made that could create pressure for somebody to make a decision in a particular way. So lots of different reasons and a very early area of research for FASD, I would say in general. Great question though.
Thank you. Another question was, what is enculturation?
Yeah, so enculturation is a term that's used differently in the research literature in the context that I was using it in. It sort of talks about the extent or the gradual process of acquiring the characteristics or norms of a sort of dominant culture So it may apply when a person shifts from living in one place to another place, and how well that sense of fit with the culture that they're living in is. I see the
Thank
next
you.
one.
Yeah,
You go
I can
ahead.
read it, or you can read it. Whatever you prefer. So the next question is, what is the most common reason why people with FASD are involved in the criminal justice system?
That's a really good question. I would say the evidence doesn't tell us a single most common reason. I think broadly, when we think even outside of the FASD context, when we think broadly about the kinds of really important risk factors associated with people being at increased odds of committing crimes or experiencing problematic trajectories through the criminal legal system, lots of those risk factors are environmental, some of them are interpersonal, and they can come together to create this increased constellation of risk. And so while we know kind of what many of the common sorts of risk factors that might lead to increased risk of offending are, they're still unique for each person. And I wouldn't say we have research to this point that says it's this factor or it's this factor singularly that can lead to this increased risk. But I think about it more as this confluence or coming together of risk factors that might relate to early adverse difficulties, neurodevelopmental differences and impairments, a lack of support, a lack of protective factors, and then social systems that sort of don't recognize and put into place the right kinds of preventative and supportive resources and supports for caregivers at an early age, and for children and youth with FASD who may be experiencing some of those difficulties. That early preventative intervention lens is probably missing too. So I don't think we can say it's a single factor, but rather that the confluence of risk combined with really not understanding all the kinds of factors that may be at play for that individual, and then not having that understanding to put into place sort of that early and really sufficient approach to preventative support that could change that pathway.
Thank you. The next question is, if an individual has been charged and is suspected of having FASD, can a psychological assessment be court ordered?
That's a great question. And in Canada, it totally depends on where you live and probably who's representing you in the kind of context. Certainly, the Youth Criminal Justice Act includes provisions for assessments to be able to be ordered by relevant professionals, be they medical assessments or psychological assessments. That is much less clearly available for adults, given differences in criminal legislation. Some provinces and territories, there are pathways that allow funding or a court order for an individual to undergo an assessment, and some there are not. So there's huge variability, and I would say that one of the major barriers, in addition to there just not being enough diagnostic services, particularly for adults in the criminal legal context, a barrier is how those kinds of diagnostic assessments would be funded. In Canada, where the division of powers and responsibilities for funding really shift between federal and provincial responsibilities, it can be tricky by the time you're navigating the criminal legal system for that piece. And so the short answer is yes, sometimes, but not often enough. And certainly, I think that kind of understanding is needed to really ensure that supports and solutions are tailored when it comes to criminal sanctions.
Thank you. Then we had a few comments, I think, that were pertaining to your response to the first question. Someone said, don't they just feel like they are making social connections? And then someone was saying difficulty understanding the question and assuming the remainder of the question, difficulty processing what is being asked, simply having a standard answer of yes or no without even understanding what is being asked of them. And
I
then we have
agree.
another,
All those things. You got it.
Then we had another question saying, never thought I would understand this legal presentation, but since I understand CanFASD's movement, this was well explained. What is the best thing for parents to advocate in a community that is not FASD informed? Is it best to get an advocate? And have you noticed in your research the medic alert for FASD an important accommodation?
Those are a lot of great questions, and thank you. Yeah, we certainly try to cover a lot in a short amount of time, so I'm always glad when these webinars are recorded, because certainly when I'm attending them, I like to be able to go back and listen to sections again and think about them for different perspectives. There are a couple of questions in there. I'm not actually aware of research or evaluation showing sort of data on the impacts of this sort of ID or medical alert bracelet programs. I've certainly heard folks feel that they're really important and that it can provide an important advocacy tool, communicating that bridge between individuals with FASD themselves and police and different agencies, so that they can articulate that they have unique needs and they require a different approach to support. I'm not aware of published data on the efficacy of those programs, but they're certainly out there, either wearing a bracelet or carrying a little card that can help an individual explain sort of their unique needs. And then the middle of the question was asking about advocacy. I definitely think that advocating for ensuring the professionals that you're working with, or that your youth may be working with, if you're a caregiver, also sort of trying to provide support for a young person who's criminally involved, is critical. I think there are lots of really terrific resources that you can easily point them to in terms of free basic FASD training, as well as more advanced level training for criminal legal professionals and members of the judiciary, for instance, on both. Here we heard about them at the beginning of the presentation in Ontario, as well as those resources and training opportunities offered by the Canada FASD Research Network. I also just acknowledge and validate that the level of advocacy can be really tiring and exhausting for caregivers who are trying to make sure that professionals are adequately informed and supporting their young person in the way that makes sense. And so I do think those support opportunities for caregivers themselves, for being able to connect with other caregivers, for being able to connect with FASD informed community partners who can help share that advocacy load, to be able to have respite, and that those things are just so important and underfunded, and that can make it really challenging for caregivers to do that much needed advocacy work. So I just want to acknowledge that piece too.
Thank you. Another question, someone said, I really appreciate the strength and protective factors in criminal legal system, I'm assuming, or criminally and legally involved youth.
Yeah.
How do you plan to use this information or tool to help this population and their support system?
Yeah, so I think this question is looking at Chantal Ritter's research. She's a passionate training clinician who's off on internship next year and will soon be a child clinical psychologist in the provinces of Ontario. So I think in practical ways, this research travels with us and the members of our research team into clinical practice. But it's a really important question around knowledge translation. And I do think the criminal legal system and youth criminal legal systems are slowly shifting to also adopt a less deficit or risk focused perspective and take a more balanced, holistic approach to understanding youth. But I think this kind of information can be shared with service providers, clinicians conducting risk assessments, probation officers trying to develop a program of support and understand risk and protective factors, that being able to share this information in a balanced way can give those providers they themselves a more balanced and holistic understanding of youth. I think that can help combat stigma. I think it can help expand and understand really more holistic and appropriate ways of understanding all the possibilities and future ways of thriving available and accessible to everybody, including people with FASD. And I know that Chantal, who's leading this research, is a huge advocate of implementation and knowledge translation in this area. So you can count on learning more about it. And she's presented a little bit on it with the Canada FASD Research Network, and you'll be hearing more about it in the upcoming year or two.
Thank you. Another question was, if a youth has been diagnosed with FASD, who has been diagnosed with FASD, gives a statement to the police without parent present, why is it that the statement goes to court? An individual with FASD does not know his or her rights.
That's a great question. And I usually start by saying, I'm not a lawyer, clinical psychologist, forensic psychologist. And when those kinds of situations happen, I actually think advocating for getting access to legal advice is really critical. Sometimes folks, particularly if they haven't previously had experience with the criminal legal system, try and navigate things independently for a little bit. We can figure this out. I'm sure it's just an interview. We'll just explain. And I think that misses a really crucial opportunity for support to ensure just exactly your point, that a young person themselves, their parent or caregiver, an adult themselves really, truly, fully understands and has the support they need to navigate the system, taking advantage of those really critical rights that are available to each of us. And that youth with FASD, based on our research, all the more seem to really need that extra support. That can be challenging because other studies have shown that public defenders, folks who have public funding for providing defense support, and even other sort of privately funded lawyers have limited time. And so our system isn't really well structured to be able to ensure that they're receiving enough time and support to really fulsomely understand things. But I do think that having contact and ensuring that you're making aware legal counsel that you may be supporting a person with vulnerabilities, unique vulnerabilities, is really critical in the process. And that statements do make it to court all the time that were made without full understanding and appreciation of rights. Our case law review found several cases where those had then been challenged. The admissibility of those statements had been challenged in court. And so you can read more about that too when our paper comes out. And there's also a really fabulous, I'll add it to the end of my slides if there's a handout, Ontario Legal Justice website that includes key information and case law about legally relevant FASD issues. And I really like the website. It's really accessible. It's written in lay language. So if you want to learn more about any of these issues, you can go and see definitions and example cases and how they've worked themselves out in the criminal legal system.
Thank you. And I think that's all the time we have today for the questions. Thank you all for attending. And thank you again, Dr. McLachlan, for participating. It was a great presentation, and I wish you all a very good day.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great day.